The coffee cup slipped from Margaret's trembling fingers, shattering against the marble kitchen floor. As she bent to clean up the pieces, her sleeve rode up, revealing a pattern of purple and yellow bruises wrapped around her forearm like twisted jewelry. Thomas Whitmore froze in the doorway, his morning newspaper forgotten in his grip. In 3 years of employing Margaret as his cook, he had never seen her hands shake. But what he discovered about those bruises would change everything. He thought he knew about the quiet woman who had been preparing his meals with such careful precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Whitmore had always prided himself on being observant. It came with 32 years of running Whitmore and Associates, one of Denver's most successful architectural firms. Details mattered in his world: the precise angle of a beam, the exact shade of paint, the way natural light fell across a room at different times of day. Yet somehow, he had missed the subtle changes happening right under his own roof. Margaret Chen had been his cook for 3 years, ever since his wife Eleanor passed away from cancer. The house had felt impossibly empty after the funeral, with its 5 bedrooms and sprawling kitchen that Eleanor had loved so much. Friends and family had urged him to sell, to downsize to something more manageable for a man living alone. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to leave the Tudor-style home on Maple Ridge Drive where he and Eleanor had planned to grow old together. Instead, he had hired Margaret through an upscale domestic services agency. She was 43 recently, divorced, and came with impeccable references from wealthy families in Aspen and Boulder. Her cooking was extraordinary, not the simple hearty meals Thomas had expected, but sophisticated dishes that reminded him of the intimate dinners he and Eleanor used to share at their favorite restaurants. Coq au vin with pearl onions and fresh thyme, pan-seared duck breast with cherry gastrique, handmade pasta with wild mushroom ragu that filled the house with the kind of warmth Thomas thought he'd lost forever. Margaret worked Monday through Friday, arriving each morning at 7:30 sharp and leaving by 4 in the afternoon. She was efficient, professional, and refreshingly unobtrusive. Unlike the previous housekeeper who had chattered constantly about her grandchildren and her husband's health problems, Margaret kept their interactions brief and focused. She would greet Thomas with a polite "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," present him with the day's menu for his approval, and then disappear into the kitchen to work her culinary magic. Thomas appreciated the routine. It gave his day structure without forcing him into conversations he wasn't ready to have. Margaret seemed to understand this instinctively. She never asked about his late wife, never commented on the framed photographs that still lined the hallway, never tried to fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply cooked beautiful meals and left them perfectly plated in the dining room, often with small touches that showed her attention to detail. A sprig of fresh rosemary beside the roasted potatoes, a few drops of aged balsamic artistically drizzled around the plate's edge. The first time Thomas noticed something amiss was on a Wednesday morning in early October. Margaret was preparing his breakfast, usually fresh fruit, steel-cut oats, and coffee so perfect it rivaled his favorite downtown cafe, when she reached up to retrieve a bowl from the upper cabinet. Her chef's coat sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing what looked like a dark mark on her wrist. Thomas glanced up from his iPad, where he'd been reviewing blueprints for a new office complex, but Margaret had already pulled her sleeve down and continued working as if nothing had happened. He told himself it was probably nothing. People got bruises all the time, bumping into furniture, carrying heavy grocery bags, any number of innocent explanations. Margaret was petite, maybe 5'3", with delicate features and the kind of graceful movements that came from years of professional kitchen work. It wouldn't be unusual for someone her size to occasionally knock into things, but over the following weeks, Thomas found himself paying closer attention. Not deliberately. He wasn't the type of man to spy on his employees, but with the heightened awareness that comes when something doesn't feel quite right. Margaret had always been punctual, but now she arrived exactly at 7:30, never a minute early or late, as if she were timing her entrance carefully. She had always been quiet, but her silence seemed different somehow, more guarded, more deliberate. Her cooking remained flawless. If anything, the meals had become even more elaborate. Last Tuesday, she had prepared a 5-course dinner that would have impressed the food critics at Denver's finest restaurants. A amuse-bouche of smoked trout with crème fraiche followed by butternut squash soup with truffle oil, then perfectly seared scallops with cauliflower puree, herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted root vegetables, and finally a chocolate soufflé that had somehow managed to rise to impossible heights despite being prepared by just one person in a home kitchen. Thomas had eaten alone in his dining room, as he did every night, but found himself wondering why Margaret was putting so much effort into meals for a single person. Was she trying to prove something? Was she worried about her job security? Or was there something else entirely driving this sudden surge of culinary ambition? The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. Thomas had always been good at reading people. It was an essential skill in his business, where he regularly dealt with demanding clients, temperamental contractors, and city officials who could make or break a project with a single signature. But Margaret remained an enigma. In 3 years, he knew almost nothing about her personal life beyond the basic information from her employment file. Divorced. No children listed as emergency contacts. Previous address in Boulder. He realized he didn't even know where she lived now. The agency had handled all the paperwork, and Margaret's paychecks were direct deposited into her bank account. She had never mentioned friends or family, never taken personal phone calls during work hours, never asked for time off for holidays or special occasions. It was as if she existed only within the walls of his house, materializing each morning to create beautiful meals, and then vanishing back into whatever life she led beyond his property lines. The second incident occurred on a Friday afternoon. In late October, Thomas had come home early from a client meeting, entering through the kitchen door as he often did to avoid tracking mud through Eleanor's pristine front foyer. Margaret was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven. Some kind of risotto, he guessed, based on the rhythmic motion of her wooden spoon and the rich aroma of white wine and saffron. She didn't hear him come in, and for a moment Thomas stood quietly in the doorway, appreciating the almost meditative quality of her movements. Margaret cooked the way he imagined artists painted, with complete focus and an intuitive understanding of her medium. She added ingredients without measuring, adjusted seasoning by scent alone, and somehow knew exactly when each element had reached perfect doneness. Then she reached across the stove to turn down the heat on a second burner, and her sleeve caught on the pot handle. As she untangled herself, Thomas saw them clearly this time. Dark bruises on her forearm that looked distinctly like finger marks. 4 oval shadows on one side, a larger mark on the other, as if someone had grabbed her arm with considerable force. Margaret must have sensed his presence because she spun around, quickly tugging her sleeves down to cover her wrists. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Thomas saw something flash across her face. Fear, he thought, though it was gone so quickly he couldn't be certain. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice perfectly composed, "I didn't hear you come in. Dinner won't be ready for another hour. I'm making mushroom risotto with grilled prawns." "That sounds wonderful," Thomas replied, though his mind was racing. "Please don't let me interrupt. I'll be in my study if you need anything." He retreated to his home office, but found it impossible to concentrate on the building permits spread across his desk. Those bruises had not been caused by bumping into furniture or carrying heavy bags. Someone had grabbed Margaret's arm hard enough to leave marks that were still visible days later. The pattern was too deliberate, too human, to be anything accidental. Thomas found himself thinking about Margaret's employment history. The agency had provided references from her previous positions, all glowing reviews from wealthy families, who praised her culinary skills and professional demeanor. But now he wondered what those references hadn't said. Had her previous employers noticed anything unusual? Had anyone thought to ask why such a talented cook might leave a good position to work for a widower who barely spoke to her? The weekend passed slowly. Thomas spent Saturday morning at his office, trying to lose himself in the technical drawings for a new mixed-use development. But Margaret's bruised arm kept intruding on his thoughts. He considered calling the domestic agency to ask about her background, but wasn't sure what questions he could reasonably ask without seeming intrusive or paranoid. By Sunday evening, he had almost convinced himself he was overreacting. People led complicated lives, and he had no right to pry into Margaret's personal affairs simply because he'd noticed some marks on her arm. She was an adult, a professional, perfectly capable of handling whatever situation she might be facing. His job was to pay her fairly and treat her with respect, not to play amateur detective based on a few seconds of observation. But Monday morning brought a new development that shattered his attempts at rationalization. Margaret arrived precisely at 7:30, as always, carrying her usual leather bag and wearing a crisp white chef's coat that made her look like she'd stepped out of a high-end restaurant kitchen. She greeted him with her customary politeness and began preparing his breakfast: fresh berries with Greek yogurt and a soft-boiled egg with whole grain toast. Thomas was reading the Denver Post's business section when he heard the crash. Looking up, he saw Margaret standing frozen beside the kitchen island, staring down at the shattered remains of his coffee cup. Dark liquid spread across the white marble floor, and ceramic fragments glittered like broken promises in the morning sunlight, streaming through the bay window. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll clean it up immediately. I'll replace the cup, of course. I don't know what happened. My hands just dot. She trailed off and knelt to gather the larger pieces, her movements quick and nervous. As she reached for a shard near the kitchen island's base, her sleeve rode up once again. This time, Thomas saw not just the fading bruises on her forearm, but fresh marks on her wrist, red scratches that looked recent, maybe from the night before. Margaret realized her sleeve had shifted and quickly pulled it down, but it was too late. She looked up at Thomas with an expression that held equal parts shame and terror, as if she'd been caught in some terrible crime. For several seconds, neither of them moved or spoke. The kitchen's silence was broken only by the soft drip of spilled coffee hitting the floor and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Thomas set down his newspaper and stood slowly, his mind working through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Margaret was being hurt by someone. The evidence was right there in front of him, written in bruises and scratches across her pale skin. But by whom? And why hadn't she sought help? "Margaret," he said gently, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "Are you all right?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She scrambled to her feet, still clutching ceramic fragments in her palm. "I'm fine, Mr. Whitmore. Just clumsy this morning. I'll have your coffee ready in just a moment." "I'm not talking about the cup," Thomas said. "I'm talking about your arms." The color drained from Margaret's face. She looked toward the kitchen door as if calculating whether she could reach it before Thomas could stop her. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, like a small animal cornered by a predator. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Thomas took a careful step closer, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. "Margaret, I can see that someone has hurt you. Those aren't bruises from cooking or cleaning. Someone grabbed you. Someone scratched you, and I think you're scared of them." Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders began to shake, and tears started streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound. She stood there in his kitchen, surrounded by broken ceramic and spilled coffee, crying silently as 3 years of carefully maintained professional distance crumbled between them. "Please," she finally managed to say. "Please don't ask me about this. I can't. I just can't." But Thomas knew he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Whatever was happening to Margaret, whatever had put those marks on her skin, and that fear in her eyes, it was serious enough to make her risk her job by begging him to ignore it. And that told him everything he needed to know about just how dangerous her situation might be. Thomas moved to the kitchen cabinet and retrieved a dustpan and brush, then knelt beside Margaret to help collect the remaining ceramic pieces. He worked silently, giving her time to compose herself while demonstrating that he wasn't going to pressure her for immediate answers. The simple act of cleaning up together seemed to calm her slightly, though she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "Why don't you sit down?" Thomas suggested once they'd finished sweeping up the debris. "I'll make the coffee today." Margaret looked genuinely shocked by the suggestion. "Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't possibly." "Margaret." He spoke her name firmly but kindly. "Sit, please." She perched on the edge of one of the kitchen island stools, her posture rigid and ready to flee. Thomas busied himself with the coffee machine, a high-end Italian model that Eleanor had insisted on buying during their trip to Rome 5 years ago. He'd watched Margaret use it hundreds of times, but now found himself fumbling with the controls, grateful for something to do with his hands while his mind processed what he'd witnessed. The kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of grinding beans and steaming milk. Thomas had always found these morning rituals soothing, but today they felt charged with tension. He could sense Margaret watching his every movement, probably critiquing his technique and wondering why her employer was suddenly playing barista in his own home. "I met Eleanor in a coffee shop," Thomas said suddenly, surprising himself. He rarely talked about his late wife, especially not to Margaret. It was 1987, and she was a graduate student at DU studying art history. "I was a young architect, completely full of myself, wearing an expensive suit I couldn't really afford." She was sitting in this little cafe near campus, surrounded by books about Renaissance painters, and I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. He glanced at Margaret, who was listening with the polite attention she gave to his occasional requests for menu changes or household preferences. I spilled coffee all over her notes trying to introduce myself. Thomas continued, pouring steamed milk into 2 cups with considerably more success than his first attempt 35 years ago. Ruined 3 hours of research on Caravaggio. She should have thrown me out of the cafe, but instead she laughed. Said anyone clumsy enough to destroy her homework while wearing a suit that expensive must be either very nervous or very interested. Margaret's mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "What did you tell her?" "Both," Thomas admitted, setting a perfect cappuccino in front of her. "Definitely both." We spent the next 4 hours talking about art and architecture, about how buildings and paintings both try to capture something permanent in an impermanent world. She made me see my work differently, made me understand that what I was designing weren't just structures, but spaces where people would live and work, and fall in love. He sat down across from her, cradling his own cup. We were married 2 years later. Eleanor always said that the best relationships begin with someone being brave enough to make themselves vulnerable, even if it means risking embarrassment or rejection. Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she didn't look away. Thomas could see that she understood the subtext of his story, that vulnerability, while frightening, was sometimes the only path to safety. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with herself. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand the situation. It's complicated." "Most situations involving domestic violence are complicated," Thomas said gently. Margaret flinched as if he'd struck her. "I never said anything about You didn't have to. Thomas kept his voice calm and matter-of-fact. I've seen those bruises develop over the past few weeks. I know what handprint bruises look like, Margaret. And I know that whatever is happening to you, it's escalating. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look younger and more fragile than her 43 years. You don't know anything about my life outside this house. You're right, I don't. But I know that for 3 years, you've been the most reliable, professional person I've ever employed. You've never been late, never called in sick, never asked for advances on your salary or time off for personal emergencies. That tells me you're either incredibly healthy and have no personal life whatsoever, or you're terrified of doing anything that might jeopardize this job. Margaret stared into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she was afraid to ask. It also tells me, Thomas continued, that this job represents more than just income for you. It's stability. It's a safe place to spend 8 hours a day. And the fact that you're willing to come to work with visible injuries rather than risk. Taking time off suggests that home isn't safe at all. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft tick of the antique clock on the kitchen wall. Thomas had bought that clock for Eleanor on their 10th anniversary, a piece she'd admired in a shop in Boulder during one of their weekend getaways. Now it seemed to be marking time towards some crucial decision point that neither he nor Margaret was quite ready to reach. His name is David, Margaret said finally, her voice so quiet Thomas had to lean forward to hear her. David Carpenter. We've been ... We've been living together for 8 months. Thomas waited, sensing that pushing for more information would only cause her to retreat back into silence. He wasn't like this when we first met, Margaret continued, staring at a point somewhere beyond Thomas's shoulder. He was charming, attentive. He brought me flowers and took me to nice restaurants. He said he'd never met anyone who could cook like me, that I had a gift most people could only dream of having. She paused to sip her coffee, and Thomas noticed that her hands were steadier now, as if the act of speaking was somehow grounding her. He's a real estate agent, commercial properties, mostly office buildings and retail spaces. Very successful, or at least that's what he told me. He drives a BMW, wears expensive suits, always has his phone buzzing with what he says are important deals. He made me feel like I was dating someone important, someone who moved in circles I'd never had access to before. Thomas nodded, recognizing the pattern. Charm followed by isolation, followed by control. He'd seen it happen to the daughter of one of his business partners, a bright young woman who'd gradually disappeared from family gatherings and social events after becoming involved with a man who claimed to adore her. When did things change? He asked. Margaret's jaw tightened. About 3 months ago. He started questioning why I spent so much time at work, why I needed to prepare such elaborate meals for just one person. He said it seemed excessive, that maybe I was trying to impress my employer in inappropriate ways. The accusation was so absurd that Thomas almost laughed, but he could see from Margaret's expression that David's suggestions had been deeply hurtful and deliberately designed to undermine her confidence in her professional abilities. He started showing up here sometimes, Margaret continued, parking across the street when I was supposed to get off work, timing how long it took me to come out to my car. If I was 5 minutes late because I was finishing a sauce or cleaning up after a more complicated meal, he'd accuse me of lying about what I was really doing. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had a security system with cameras covering the front and back entrances to his property, but he'd never thought to check the footage for suspicious vehicles. How many times had this David been watching his house, monitoring Margaret's movements, without Thomas even knowing? Then he started going through my things, Margaret said. My purse, my phone, even my recipe notebooks. He said he was just curious about my work, but he'd ask detailed questions about every ingredient I'd bought, every technique I'd used. If I couldn't remember exactly why I'd chosen one spice over another, or if my explanation didn't match what he thought he'd observed. He'd accuse me of hiding something. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing not just the bruises Thomas had already seen, but newer marks, thin red lines across her wrists that looked like rope burns. "Last week, you decided I was stealing from you," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as she continued her confession. "He said no one gets paid as much as I do just for cooking, that I must be taking money or valuables, and you were either too stupid to notice or too polite to confront me about it." Thomas's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The idea that someone would accuse Margaret, who had never taken so much as a single tea bag from his kitchen, of theft was outrageous. But he could see how such an accusation would eat away at someone who took pride in their professional integrity. He tied me to a chair in his apartment and went through every receipt in my wallet, every deposit slip in my checkbook. He wanted me to admit that I was supplementing my income somehow, that no one pays a cook what you pay me unless there's something else involved. The casual way she described being physically restrained sent ice through Thomas's veins. This wasn't just emotional or verbal abuse. David was escalating to physical restraint and interrogation. "Margaret," Thomas said carefully, "where did you tell him you were yesterday? The scratches on your wrists, they look fresh." She pulled her sleeves back down, but not before Thomas noticed that the marks extended higher up her arms than he'd initially realized. "I told him I was working late because you were having dinner guests," Margaret said. "It was a lie. I needed some time to think. I drove around for 3 hours, trying to figure out what to do. When I finally came home, he was waiting." She didn't elaborate on what had happened when she'd returned to David's apartment, but the fresh injuries spoke for themselves. "He knows something is wrong," Margaret continued. "He can tell that I'm pulling away, that I'm scared of him. And that's making him more suspicious, more controlling. Last night he said that if I was going to act like I had something to hide, he'd give me a real reason to be secretive." Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, afraid that if he gripped it any tighter, he might shatter it the way Margaret had earlier. "Margaret, you can't go back there. Whatever he's threatening, whatever he's told you will happen if you leave, it's not worth your life." "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice rising with panic. "He knows where I work. He knows your address, your schedule, probably your full name and business information by now. If I disappear, if I don't come home tonight, he'll come looking for me, and he'll start here." The implication hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. David wasn't just threatening Margaret. By extension, he was threatening Thomas as well. And Margaret, in her desire to protect both herself and her employer, had been trying to manage an impossible situation entirely on her own. "Has he ever been inside this house?" Thomas asked. Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, never. But he's asked detailed questions about the layout, about your routine, about whether you have a security system. I tried not to answer, but when he gets angry..." She touched her ribs gingerly, and Thomas realized that the visible bruises on her arms were probably just the beginning of her injuries. "We're going to fix this," Thomas said firmly. "I don't know exactly how yet, but we're going to get you away from him safely. You're not going back to that apartment, and you're not going to handle this alone anymore." Margaret looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't know what he's capable of. He's not just some angry boyfriend. He's smart, he's connected, and he's convinced that everyone is either with him or against him. If you try to help me, if he thinks you're interfering with his relationship, then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance to retaliate," Thomas said. "But first, I need you to tell me everything. Every threat he's made, every detail about his routine, every piece of information that might help us stay one step ahead of him." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust this man who had just offered to risk his own safety for hers. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But once I tell you everything, there's no going back. Once you know what David is really like, what he's really capable of, your life will never be the same either. Thomas thought about Eleanor, about the courage it had taken for her to fight cancer for 2 long years, never once complaining. About the pain or the uncertainty. He thought about the promises he'd made at her bedside, about living with integrity and treating others with the kindness she'd always shown. "Then we'd better get started," he said. Margaret's revelations came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last. She spoke methodically, as if she'd been rehearsing these details in her mind for months, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Thomas listened without interruption, making mental notes while trying to keep his growing anger from showing on his face. David Carpenter owned a penthouse apartment in the Lodhu district, one of those gleaming high-rises that had transformed Denver's downtown landscape over the past decade. He drove a silver BMW X5 with personalized plates reading "Closer One," a reference, Margaret explained, to his supposedly impressive ability to close difficult real estate deals. He worked for premier commercial properties, though Margaret had begun to suspect that his success was more fiction than fact. "He never seems to actually go to showings," she said, absently stirring her now cold coffee. "When I first met him, he was always rushing off to meet clients or inspect properties. But lately, he spends most of his time at home, watching financial news channels and making phone calls that sound more like arguments than negotiations." Thomas absorbed this information while calculating distances and timing. The Lodhu apartment was only 15 minutes from his house in normal traffic. David could easily drive by multiple times per day without it seeming unusual or suspicious. The thought that this man had been surveilling his property for months made Thomas's skin crawl. "Tell me about his schedule," Thomas said. "When does he usually leave the apartment? When does he come back?" Margaret's brow furrowed as she considered the question. "It's unpredictable, which is part of what makes him so controlling. Sometimes he's gone all day, sometimes he barely leaves at all. But he always wants to know exactly where I am and when I'll be home. He calls or texts constantly when we're apart." She pulled out her phone, a newer iPhone that looked expensive. "He bought this for me 2 months ago. Said my old phone was embarrassing, that it made him look bad when we were out together. But I think the real reason was so he could track my location." Thomas wasn't surprised. Location tracking had become a common tool among abusers, a way to maintain control without having to physically follow their victims everywhere. "Have you ever tried turning off the location services?" "Once," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "He noticed within an hour. The bruises on my ribs are from that night." The casual way she mentioned serious physical injuries, as if they were minor inconveniences, broke something inside Thomas. He thought of his own daughter, Jessica, who lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 young children. If anyone ever laid a hand on her, if anyone made her feel the kind of fear he saw in Margaret's eyes, Thomas would move heaven and earth to protect her. "What about family?" Thomas asked. "Parents, siblings, friends who might help you?" Margaret shook her head. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 28. No siblings, and David. He made sure I didn't stay close with the friends I had when we met. He'd always find something wrong with them. They were jealous of our relationship, or they were bad influences, or they didn't understand what real love looked like." Another classic isolation tactic. Thomas was beginning to understand just how methodically David had dismantled Margaret's support system, leaving her entirely dependent on him for social contact and emotional validation. "He reads my text messages," Margaret continued. "Goes through my email, my social media accounts. I tried to reach out to my friend Sarah once. We used to work together at a restaurant in Boulder, but David saw the message before I could send it. He deleted her contact information and told me that if I was so unhappy with him, maybe I should just leave and see how well I did on my own." "But you didn't leave." "I tried to, actually. About 6 weeks ago, I packed a bag while he was supposedly at a client meeting and drove to a motel near the airport. I thought maybe I could stay there for a few days, figure out my next steps. Margaret's hands began to tremble again, and Thomas noticed that she kept glancing toward the kitchen windows, as if expecting to see David's BMW pulling into the driveway. "He found me within 3 hours," she said. "I still don't know how. Maybe the phone. Maybe he'd put some kind of tracking device in my car. Maybe he just called every motel in the area. But he showed up at my room with flowers and tears, saying he was sorry, that he'd been under stress with work, and he knew he'd been taking it out on me unfairly." Thomas had heard similar stories before. The cycle of abuse, violence followed by remorse, promises to change, a brief honeymoon period, then escalating tension leading to more violence. It was as predictable as it was devastating. He convinced the motel manager that we'd had a lover's quarrel, that I was upset and not thinking clearly. Made it sound like he was the concerned boyfriend trying to help his unstable girlfriend. The manager actually helped him load my bags back into his car. "And you went with him?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. What choice did I have? I was in a strange place with no money, except what was in my wallet, no friends to call, no family to help me. David promised things would be different, that he'd get counseling, that he understood he had a problem with jealousy and control. But things didn't get better, they got worse, much worse. He said that since I'd proven I couldn't be trusted on my own, he needed to take a more active role in managing my life. That's when he started timing my trips to the grocery store, questioning every purchase, demanding to see receipts for everything I bought. Margaret stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen window, peering through the blinds at the empty street beyond. Thomas realized she'd been doing this periodically. Throughout their conversation, checking for signs that David might be watching the house. "He made me quit my gym membership," she said without turning around. "Said I was spending too much time there, that I must be meeting people he didn't know about. Then he started picking me up from work instead of letting me drive myself. Sighed. It would be romantic, that couples should spend more time together." But Thomas understood the real motivation. By controlling Margaret's transportation, David could ensure she couldn't make any stops or detours without his knowledge. It was another layer of surveillance disguised as affection. "The worst part," Margaret said, finally returning to her seat, "is that I started to believe him. When someone tells you every day that you're unstable, that you're paranoid, that you're lucky anyone puts up with your problems, you begin to think maybe they're right. Maybe you are the problem." Thomas felt a surge of protective anger so strong. It surprised him. In 3 years of employing Margaret, he had never seen any evidence of instability or paranoia. She was one of the most competent, reliable people he'd ever worked with. The idea that David had systematically undermined her self-confidence was infuriating. "Margaret," Thomas said firmly, "nothing about you is unstable or paranoid. You're a skilled professional who has managed my household flawlessly for 3 years. You're punctual, creative, detail-oriented, and one of the kindest people I've ever met. David's opinions about you say everything about him and nothing about who you actually are." She looked at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten that other people might have different perspectives on her character and abilities. "But he knows so much about me," she said. "About my past, my insecurities, the mistakes I've made. He uses that information to make me feel like I'm the one causing all our problems." "What kind of mistakes?" Thomas asked gently. Margaret hesitated, then seemed to decide that she'd already revealed too much to hold back now. "My divorce. My ex-husband left me for his secretary. A cliché so perfect it would be funny if it weren't so humiliating. I was devastated, convinced that I'd failed as a wife, that I wasn't interesting enough or attractive enough to keep a man's attention." Thomas could see where this was heading. David had identified Margaret's vulnerability around abandonment and used it to make her feel grateful for his attention, no matter how toxic that attention became. David said he was different from my ex-husband, that he would never betray me the way I'd been betrayed before. But then he'd turn around and accuse me of being the kind of woman who drives men away, who creates drama and conflict in relationships. Classic manipulation, Thomas said. He presents himself as your savior while simultaneously reinforcing the very insecurities that make you feel like you need saving. Margaret nodded, looking relieved that someone finally understood the psychological trap she'd been caught in. Exactly. And when I tried to point out the contradictions in what he was saying, he'd tell me I was being too analytical, that I was overthinking things instead of just accepting love when it was offered to me. Thomas checked his watch and was surprised to see that they'd been talking for over an hour. Margaret's shift was supposed to end at 4, which meant David would expect her home by 4:30 at the latest. They had perhaps 6 hours before her absence would trigger whatever retaliation David had planned. "We need to make some decisions," Thomas said. "First, and most importantly, you are not going back to that apartment tonight. I don't care what threats David has made or what consequences he's promised. Your safety is more important than managing his anger." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas held up a hand to stop her. "Second, we need to think strategically about how to extract you from this situation without putting either of us in more danger. That means understanding David's patterns, his weaknesses, and the resources he has available to track you down or retaliate against me." He pulled out his own phone and opened the Notes app. "Tell me everything you know about his daily routine. What time does he usually wake up? When does he shower? When does he check his phone? I need to understand when he's most distracted and when he's most vigilant." Margaret looked overwhelmed by the prospect of planning what amounted to an escape operation. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand how smart he is. He's already thought of everything we're thinking of. He's probably already anticipated that I might try to leave again, and he's made plans for that possibility." "Then we'll have to be smarter," Thomas said simply. "I've spent 30 years solving complex problems, Margaret. I know how to analyze a situation, identify the variables, and develop solutions that account for multiple contingencies." He stood up and walked to his kitchen junk drawer, retrieving a legal pad and several pens. "Architecture is really just organized problem solving on a large scale. You start with constraints, budget, building codes, environmental factors, client requirements, and you figure out how to create something functional and beautiful within those limitations." Margaret watched him spread the legal pad on the kitchen island and begin sketching what looked like a flowchart. "Right now, our constraints are David's surveillance capabilities, the limited time we have before he notices you're missing, and the need to get you somewhere safe without him being able to track you down. But we also have advantages he doesn't know about, such as," Thomas smiled grimly, "such as the fact that I have resources he's probably never considered. I own a successful business with connections throughout the city. I have a security system with cameras that may have captured footage of him watching this house. I have financial resources that can help you disappear if necessary. And most importantly, I'm not afraid of him." Margaret stared at him as if he'd announced his intention to wrestle a grizzly bear with his bare hands. "Mr. Whitmore, you're a kind man, but kindness won't protect you from someone like David. He doesn't play by normal rules. He doesn't care about being reasonable or fair. When he decides someone is his enemy, he destroys them. Then it's a good thing I don't intend to give him the opportunity," Thomas said, continuing to sketch out his preliminary plan. "Now tell me about his apartment building. Security cameras, doorman, keycard access. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Margaret provided a detailed description of David's apartment building that made Thomas realize they were dealing with someone who had chosen his living situation specifically for control and surveillance. The Meridian Tower was a 40-story glass and steel monument to Denver's booming downtown development, complete with a 24-hour concierge, keycard access to all floors, and security cameras in every hallway, elevator, and common area. David's apartment is on the 32nd floor, Margaret explained, her voice taking on the flat, factual tone she used when discussing particularly painful subjects. Corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows facing east and south. He can see most of downtown from his living room, including the parking garage where I leave my car. Thomas made notes on his legal pad, sketching a rough floor plan based on Margaret's descriptions. What about building security? How closely do they monitor who comes and goes? Very closely. The concierge knows me by name, knows that I live. They're with David. They'd probably call up to the apartment if I tried to collect my things without him being present, especially if I seemed upset or in a hurry. This was exactly the kind of detail that could derail an escape attempt. Thomas realized that simply helping Margaret retrieve her belongings wasn't going to be as straightforward as driving over and loading boxes into his car. "What do you actually need from that apartment?" Thomas asked. "I mean, what items are truly irreplaceable versus things that can be replaced later when you're somewhere safe?" Margaret considered this question for several minutes, and Thomas could see her mentally cataloging her possessions and weighing their importance against the risks of trying to retrieve them. "My grandmother's recipe collection," she said finally. "It's a wooden box full of handwritten cards. Some of them are over 50 years old. They're the only thing I have left from my mother's side of the family." Thomas added this to his notes. A wooden box was portable and valuable enough to justify some level of risk. "My passport and birth certificate are in David's bedroom safe," Margaret continued, "along with my social security card and the title to my car. He said it was for safekeeping, but I realize now it was another way to make sure I couldn't leave without his permission. This was more problematic. Without proper identification and car title, Margaret would have difficulty traveling, finding new employment, or even proving her identity to potential landlords or employers. David had essentially made himself the gatekeeper to Margaret's legal existence. "Do you know the combination to the safe?" "No, David never told me what it was. But I've watched him open it a few times. It's a 6-digit code, and I noticed he always looks at a framed photograph on his dresser before entering the numbers." Thomas's architect brain immediately began working on this puzzle. People often used significant dates for passwords and safe combinations: birthdays, anniversaries, addresses. If David looked at a specific photograph before entering the code, that image probably contained the relevant information. "What's in the photograph?" "It's a picture of his parents' house in Aspen. David grew up there. His father was his ski instructor. His mother ran a boutique hotel. They died in an avalanche when David was in college, which is supposedly how he inherited enough money to get started in real estate." Thomas noted the address reference and the tragic backstory. People who had experienced significant trauma often used related dates or numbers for their passwords, partly as a way of honoring the memory and partly because traumatic events created the kind of vivid, unforgettable associations that made for memorable codes. "Do you remember the address of his parents' house? Or the date they died?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly as she understood what Thomas was suggesting. "I think the house was on Snowmass Drive, but I don't remember the exact number. The avalanche happened in February 2003, February 18th, I think. David always gets depressed around that anniversary." Thomas wrote 021803 on his legal pad, then crossed it out and wrote 021803. If David was using the date format most people preferred, he'd probably go with month, day, year rather than day, month, year. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "David has guns. Multiple guns in a locked cabinet in his home office. I don't know what kind. I don't know anything about firearms, but he's mentioned going to shooting ranges, and he's shown me pictures on his phone of targets he shot." The temperature in Thomas's kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Gun ownership wasn't unusual in Colorado, but in the context of an abusive relationship, weapons introduced a level of lethality that changed all calculations about risk and safety. Has he ever threatened you with the guns? Not directly. But when I came back from the motel that night, when he was explaining why I could never leave him again, he took me into his office and showed me the gun cabinet. He said that some people might think it was romantic, the idea of lovers dying together rather than being separated by circumstances beyond their control. Thomas's hand stilled on his legal pad. What Margaret was describing sounded dangerously close to a murder-suicide threat, the kind of escalation that domestic violence experts considered the most dangerous phase of an abusive relationship. Margaret, I need you to understand something. What David said about dying together, that wasn't romantic poetry. That was a death threat. He was telling you that if he can't have you, he'll make sure no one else can either. She nodded miserably. No. That's why I've been so careful, why I've tried so hard not to make him suspicious. I keep thinking that if I can just avoid triggering his anger, if I can keep him calm until I figure out a better plan. There is no better plan than getting you away from him immediately, Thomas said firmly. Every day you stay in that apartment, every night you go home to him, you're rolling dice with your life, and the odds are getting worse, not better. He stood up and began pacing around the kitchen island, his mind working through logistics and timing. Here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to call David and tell him you're working late tonight. Make up a story about me having unexpected dinner guests, something that would require you to prepare an elaborate meal and stay for service. Margaret looked panicked. He'll want details. He always wants details. If I can't answer his questions about who the guests are, what I'm cooking, why you didn't give me advance notice, then we'll create believable details, Thomas said. I'll call my business partner, Richard Hartley, and his wife Susan. They're old friends who've had dinner here many times. I'll ask them to actually come over tonight and have dinner, which will make your story completely true. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Richard and Susan are the kind of people who would appreciate a last-minute dinner invitation, especially if I explain that it's important. They've been worried about me since Eleanor died, always, trying to get me to be more social. Margaret watched him dial Richard's number, clearly amazed that Thomas was willing to involve his friends in what amounted to an elaborate deception designed to fool her abusive boyfriend, Richard. Thomas said when his business partner answered. It's Thomas. Listen, I know this is short notice, but would you and Susan be available for dinner tonight? I have a situation I need to discuss with you, and it would help if you could be here around 6:30. Thomas listened to Richard's response, then smiled reassuringly at Margaret. Perfect. Yes, Margaret will be cooking something special. I'm sure. See you tonight. He hung up and turned back to Margaret. There, now when you call David, you can honestly say that Mr. and Mrs. Hartley are coming for dinner at 6:30, that you're preparing duck breast with cherry sauce and roasted vegetables, and that you'll need to stay until at least 9 o'clock to serve and clean up. Margaret still looked uncertain. What if he decides to drive by? What if he wants to verify that there are actually guests here? Then he'll see Richard's Mercedes in my driveway and lights on in my dining room, Thomas said. The story will check out because it's true. He sat back down and resumed writing on his legal pad. While you're here tonight, cooking dinner and serving my guests, I'm going to make some phone calls. I have contacts in law enforcement, private security, even a few attorneys who specialize in domestic relations cases. By tomorrow morning, we'll have a comprehensive plan for getting you out of this situation safely and permanently. Margaret shook her head slowly. Mr. Whitmore, you're talking about turning your entire life upside down for someone you barely know. You're involving your friends, your business contacts, potentially putting yourself at risk with a dangerous man. Why would you do all of this for me? Thomas considered her question seriously. Why was he willing to go to such lengths for Margaret? Was it guilt over not noticing her situation sooner? Was it some misplaced attempt to honor Eleanor's memory by helping someone in need? Or was it simply that after 3 years of Margaret's quiet competence and kindness, he'd come to care about her well-being more than he'd realized? "Do you remember the first meal you cooked for me?" Thomas asked instead of answering her question directly. Margaret looked surprised by the apparent change of subject. "Beef bourguignon. You'd mentioned that it was one of your wife's favorite dishes, and I wanted to see if I could prepare it the way she would have liked." "It was perfect," Thomas said. "Not just technically perfect, though it certainly was that, but it was prepared with such care, such attention to what would bring comfort to someone who was grieving. You didn't just cook a meal, Margaret. You created an act of kindness." He gestured around the kitchen, at the space where Margaret had worked quietly and skillfully for 3 years, never intruding on his grief, but never allowing him to forget that he was still alive, still deserving of nourishment and care. "For 3 years, you've taken care of me without ever asking for anything in return except fair payment and basic respect. You've watched me slowly come back to life after losing Eleanor, and you've been part of that healing process whether you realize it or not. Now you need help, and it's my turn to provide care without asking for anything in return." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. "Besides," Thomas added with a slight smile, "Eleanor would haunt this house for eternity if I knew someone was in danger and didn't try to help. She had very strong opinions about moral obligations." Margaret laughed despite herself, a sound Thomas realized he'd never heard from her before. It transformed her face completely, making her look younger and reminding him that underneath all the fear and trauma was a woman who deserved to laugh regularly. "All right," she said finally. "Let's call David and tell him about tonight's dinner party. But if this goes wrong, if he figures out what we're really doing—" "It won't go wrong," Thomas said with more confidence than he actually felt. "We're going to be methodical, careful, and smart about this. David may be manipulative and dangerous, but he's not omniscient. He can't control what he doesn't know about." Margaret pulled out her phone and stared at it for a moment, gathering her courage. Thomas could see her mentally rehearsing the conversation, preparing herself to lie convincingly to a man who had become expert at detecting any hint of deception. "Remember," Thomas said gently, "you're not lying about working late. You really will be here cooking dinner for guests and staying late to clean up. You're just not mentioning that we're also going to be planning your escape while the Hartleys are here." Margaret took a deep breath and dialed David's number. Thomas watched her face transform as the call connected, her expression becoming carefully neutral, her voice taking on the placating tone he imagined she used whenever she had to manage David's moods. "David, it's me. I'm afraid I'm going to be late tonight." Thomas watched Margaret's face carefully as she spoke to David, noting the subtle changes in her expression and posture. Her shoulders tensed when David's voice rose on the other end of the line, and she unconsciously touched her ribs where Thomas suspected she had hidden bruises. "Yes, I understand it's unusual," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear. Thomas could see in her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore said his business partner called this morning with some kind of emergency consultation. Something about blueprints that need to be revised before a city planning meeting tomorrow." She paused, listening to David's response, and Thomas caught fragments of an angry male voice through the phone's speaker. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably accusatory and suspicious. "The Hartleys have been to the house before," Margaret continued patiently. "Mrs. Hartley has some kind of food sensitivity, so Mr. Whitmore specifically requested the duck breast because he knows she can eat it without problems." Thomas was impressed by the level of detail Margaret was providing. She was right that David would demand specifics, and she was delivering them with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she dealt with his interrogations regularly. "I know it's inconvenient," Margaret said, her voice taking on a slightly pleading tone that made Thomas's jaw clench. "But Mr. Whitmore said he'd pay me overtime for the evening. And you know we could use the extra money for your car payment next month." Another pause, this one longer, and Thomas could see Margaret's knuckles turning white as she gripped the phone. Whatever David was saying was clearly upsetting her, but she maintained her composure with what Thomas realized was probably years of practice. "No, David, I can't ask Mr. Whitmore to reschedule," Margaret said firmly. "These people are important clients, and the city meeting is tomorrow morning. If Mr. Whitmore loses this contract because I couldn't stay late to cook dinner." She trailed off, letting David draw his own conclusions about the potential consequences. Thomas noted that she'd skillfully reframed the situation from being about her choice to being about professional obligations beyond her control. "I'll text you when I'm leaving," Margaret promised. "Probably around 9:30, maybe 10 if the dinner runs long. I'll pick up groceries on the way home tomorrow morning, so don't worry about breakfast." The call ended, and Margaret sat in silence for several seconds, staring at her phone as if it might explode. "How did he sound?" Thomas asked. "Suspicious but not panicked," Margaret replied. "He doesn't like last-minute changes to my schedule, but the story about your business emergency and the overtime pay made sense to him. He's always complaining that I don't make enough money." Thomas filed this information away. David's concern about Margaret's income suggested either genuine financial stress or, more likely, another tool of psychological control. By constantly emphasizing that Margaret didn't earn enough to support herself independently, David reinforced her dependence on their relationship. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "He wants me to take pictures of the dinner. He said if I'm going to be working late, he should at least get to see what fancy meal I'm preparing for your important guests." This request sent a chill down Thomas's spine. David wasn't just monitoring Margaret's location and timing. He was now demanding visual proof of her activities. It suggested a level of paranoia and control that was rapidly escalating toward dangerous territory. "That's actually not a problem," Thomas said, though his mind was racing through the implications. "We'll make sure to document the dinner thoroughly. But this confirms what I suspected. David is becoming more suspicious and more controlling. The fact that he's demanding photographic evidence suggests he's preparing to escalate his surveillance." Margaret nodded miserably. "He does this sometimes when he thinks I'm lying about something. He'll ask for proof, then analyze every detail in the photos to try to catch inconsistencies in my story." Thomas realized they were dealing with someone who had turned surveillance and interrogation into an art form. David wasn't just an abusive boyfriend, he was operating like a professional investigator, gathering evidence and building cases against Margaret's credibility. "Show me your camera roll," Thomas said. "I want to see what kinds of pictures you usually take for him." Margaret hesitated, then handed over her phone. Thomas scrolled through recent photos and was disturbed by what he found. Nearly every image was clearly taken in response to David's demands for proof. Pictures of Margaret's lunch with timestamps, photos of grocery store receipts, images of her car's odometer showing mileage that correlated with her reported destinations. "This is stalking behavior," Thomas said bluntly. "Not just controlling or possessive, actual criminal stalking. You're being forced to document your own surveillance." The front doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Thomas checked his watch and realized that Richard and Susan Hartley had arrived exactly on time, as they always did. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were attempting, hosting a dinner party while simultaneously planning a domestic violence escape, maintaining normal social interactions while processing the revelation that Margaret was living under conditions that resembled a prison sentence. "Remember," Thomas said quickly as he headed toward the front door, "tonight you're simply working late to serve dinner to my guests. Everything else we've discussed stays between us until after they leave." Margaret nodded and began pulling ingredients. From the refrigerator, with the mechanical efficiency Thomas had observed hundreds of times before. But now he understood that her professional focus wasn't just about pride in her work. It was a survival mechanism, a way of maintaining some sense of control and competence in a life that had been systematically stripped of both. Richard and Susan Hartley were in their early 60s, a sophisticated couple who had been Thomas's friends since college. Richard was tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of professional success. Susan was petite and elegant, with sharp eyes that missed very little and a warm smile that put people immediately at ease. "Thomas," Susan exclaimed as she handed him a bottle of expensive wine. "It's so good to see you accepting social invitations again. Richard was just saying how worried we've been about you isolating yourself since Eleanor... She trailed off tactfully, but Thomas understood her concern. For the past 3 years he declined most social invitations, preferring the safety of his empty house to the well-meaning but painful sympathy of friends who had known him and Eleanor as a couple. "I know I've been difficult to reach," Thomas said as he led them into the living room. "But I think I'm finally ready to rejoin the world a bit. Margaret is preparing something special tonight, duck breast with cherry sauce." "Margaret is the cook you mentioned before?" Richard asked. "The one who's been taking such good care of you?" Thomas nodded, realizing that his friends probably had very little actual information about Margaret beyond the fact that she existed and prepared his meals. In 3 years, he'd never included her in any social interactions or mentioned details about her background or personality. "She's extraordinary," Thomas said, meaning it more deeply than his friends could possibly understand. "Professional, talented, and incredibly kind. I don't know what I would have done without her these past few years." Susan's expression softened. "It sounds like she's been exactly what you needed during a very difficult time." The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's appearance in the living room doorway. She had changed into a fresh chef's coat and had clearly taken a few minutes to compose herself, though Thomas could still see stress in the tight lines around her eyes. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Hartley," Margaret said with perfect professional courtesy. "Dinner will be ready in approximately 30 minutes. Can I offer you anything to drink while you wait?" Susan studied Margaret with the kind of attention she usually reserved for evaluating art pieces or antiques. Thomas realized that his friend's sharp eyes had probably already noticed details that most people would miss. The careful way Margaret held herself, the slight tremor in her hands despite her calm demeanor, the fact that she wore long sleeves on a warm October evening. "A glass of that Pinot Noir would be lovely," Susan said warmly. "And please, call me Susan. Anyone who takes such good care of our Thomas deserves to be treated as family rather than staff." Margaret's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected kindness, and Thomas saw her struggle with how to respond. She'd been trained by 3 years of David's psychological abuse to be suspicious of genuine warmth from strangers. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, then retreated to the kitchen to retrieve the wine and glasses. Richard settled into one of Thomas's leather armchairs and looked around the living room with professional interest. As an architect specializing in residential properties, he appreciated the way Thomas and Eleanor had restored their Tudor-style home while maintaining its historical character. "So what's this emergency consultation you mentioned?" Richard asked. "Problems with the Morrison project?" Thomas had almost forgotten the cover story he'd created for Margaret's benefit. The Morrison project was a real mixed-use development that Richard's firm was collaborating on with Thomas's company, so any discussion about it would be both believable and boring enough to avoid Susan's sustained attention. "Actually, the consultation is about something else entirely," Thomas said, lowering his voice slightly. "I need advice about a personal situation that's become complicated. Margaret is in trouble, and I'm trying to help her without making things worse." Richard's expression immediately became more serious. As someone who had known Thomas for over 30 years, He could probably count on one hand the number of times Thomas had asked for help with personal problems. "What kind of trouble?" Susan asked, her voice sharp with concern. Margaret returned with the wine service, moving with the quiet efficiency that Thomas now understood was probably learned. Behavior designed to avoid drawing unwanted attention. She poured 3 glasses of the Pinot Noir with steady hands, but Thomas noticed that she glanced toward the front windows several times, as if checking for signs of surveillance. "Margaret," Thomas said gently, "would you mind taking a few minutes to sit with us? I'd like Richard and Susan to understand the situation we're dealing with." Margaret looked genuinely shocked by this suggestion. "Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't possibly. I have dinner to finish, and your guests." "Our guests," Thomas corrected, "and they're here as much to help you as to enjoy your excellent cooking. Please sit down." Margaret perched on the edge of the sofa, clearly uncomfortable with being included in what she probably viewed as a personal conversation between Thomas and his friends. Thomas realized that David had probably trained her to believe that her problems were her own responsibility, and that asking for help was a sign of weakness or selfishness. "Margaret is being stalked and abused by her boyfriend," Thomas said without preamble. "She's been living in fear for months, and the situation is escalating toward what could become life-threatening violence." Susan's wineglass stopped halfway to her lips, and Richard straightened in his chair with the alert attention of someone who had just heard alarming news about a friend. "How can we help?" Susan asked immediately, and Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for friends who didn't waste time with questions about whether he was overreacting or getting too involved in someone else's problems. Margaret looked overwhelmed by the sudden shift from serving dinner to being the focus of concerned attention from 3 people who barely knew her. Thomas could see her struggling between the relief of finally having allies and the terror of what David might do if he discovered that she'd involved other people in their relationship. "The immediate problem is that Margaret needs to retrieve some essential items from the apartment she shares with this man," Thomas explained. "Identity documents, personal belongings, things she need to start over somewhere safe. But the building has extensive security, and he's been monitoring her movements obsessively." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Commercial real estate, high-end residential. The Meridian Tower downtown." "I know that building," Richard said. "We looked at office space on the ground floor for one of our clients last year. Very secure, very expensive. Definitely the kind of place where the concierge pays attention to who comes and goes." Thomas felt encouraged by Richard's familiarity with the location. "Margaret thinks the boyfriend may have weapons in the apartment. He's made threats that sound dangerously close to murder-suicide ideation." Susan set down her wineglass with a sharp click against the coffee table. "Margaret, honey, you can't go back there. Not tonight, not ever. Whatever you need from that apartment, it's not worth your life." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands and began to cry with the kind of deep, exhausted sobs that suggested months of suppressed fear and grief. "But I don't have anywhere else to go," she said through her tears. "I don't have family. I don't have friends David hasn't scared away. I don't have enough money saved to start over somewhere new. That apartment has everything I own, everything that proves I exist as a person." Thomas exchanged a meaningful look with Richard and Susan. His friends had just gotten their first glimpse of how completely David had isolated and controlled Margaret, and he could see their shock at the thoroughness of the psychological prison that had been constructed around her. "Margaret," Susan said firmly, "you have us now. And we're going to make sure you have everything you need to start over safely." Susan moved to sit beside Margaret on the sofa, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of maternal instincts that transcended the boundaries between strangers. Margaret flinched slightly at the unexpected touch, then seemed to melt into the comfort of human contact that didn't carry threats or conditions. "First things first," Susan said practically, pulling tissues from her purse and pressing them into Margaret's hands. "You're not alone anymore, and you're not going back to that apartment tonight. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "Thomas, you mentioned weapons. Do we know what kind of firearms we're dealing with?" "Multiple guns in a locked cabinet," Thomas replied. "Margaret doesn't know the specifics, but he's apparently shown her shooting range photos and made veiled threats about murder-suicide scenarios." Richard's jaw tightened. "That changes the risk assessment significantly. We're not just dealing with domestic violence anymore. We're potentially dealing with someone who's already planned how to kill Margaret and possibly himself if he feels cornered." Margaret looked up from her tissues, her face pale. "He keeps talking about loyalty, about how real love means never abandoning each other, no matter what happens. But the way he says it, it doesn't sound romantic. It sounds like a threat." Susan's grip on Margaret's shoulder tightened protectively. "Honey, that's not love. That's obsession with a very dangerous edge. Men who talk about dying together usually mean killing together, and they rarely ask permission first." Thomas was struck by how quickly his friends had grasped the severity of Margaret's situation. Neither Richard nor Susan had questioned whether Margaret might be exaggerating or asked what she had done to provoke David's behavior. They had simply accepted that she was in genuine danger and begun focusing on solutions. "The dinner is going to burn," Margaret said suddenly, starting to rise from the sofa. "I'll check on it," Susan said, gently pressing Margaret back down. "I've been cooking for 40 years. I think I can manage not to ruin duck breast." Susan disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Thomas and Richard to continue planning while Margaret tried to compose herself. Thomas could hear Susan moving around his kitchen with the confident efficiency of someone who understood both cooking and crisis management. "We need to approach this systematically," Richard said, pulling out his phone and opening the Notes app. "Margaret, I need you to tell me everything you know about David's schedule, his habits, his vulnerabilities. When is he most likely to be out of the apartment for extended periods?" Margaret wiped her eyes and seemed to gather her professional composure. The same focused attention she brought to menu planning now applied to escape logistics. "He usually goes to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, but only for about an hour. Sometimes he has what he calls client meetings, but I've started to suspect those aren't real business appointments." "What makes you think that?" Thomas asked. "He never brings contracts home anymore, never talks about specific properties or deals. When I first met him, he was always excited about closings and commissions, always celebrating successful negotiations. But for the past few months, it's like he's pretending to have a career rather than actually working." Richard made notes on his phone. Financial stress could be driving some of his controlling behavior. Men who feel like they're losing control of their professional lives sometimes compensate by trying to control their personal relationships more tightly. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "I think he might be using drugs. Not street drugs, but prescription medications that aren't prescribed to him. I've found pill bottles in his bathroom with other people's names on them. Anxiety medications, sleep aids, sometimes stimulants." Thomas exchanged a concerned look with Richard. Unprescribed pharmaceutical use, especially when combined with firearms and relationship obsession, created an extremely volatile situation. "That explains some of the paranoia and mood swings," Richard said grimly. "Drug interactions can make people unpredictable and dangerous, especially if he's mixing different medications without medical supervision." Susan returned from the kitchen, carrying a plate of perfectly sliced duck breast, garnished with roasted vegetables and cherry sauce. "Dinner is ready whenever you want to eat it," she announced, "and it's absolutely delicious. Margaret, you're incredibly talented." She set the plate on the coffee table and resumed her seat beside Margaret. "I also took some photos of the food for you to send to David. Beautiful presentation shots that will prove you're exactly where you said you'd be. Doing exactly what you said you'd be doing. Thomas was impressed by Susan's quick thinking. She had not only prevented dinner from burning, but had also created the photographic evidence David had demanded, all while giving Margaret time to process her emotions and plan her next steps. "Thank you," Margaret said, accepting Susan's phone to review the pictures. "These are perfect. He'll be satisfied with the documentation." "Now then," Susan said briskly, "while you send those photos to David, Richard and Thomas can continue planning your extraction from that apartment. I'm going to call my sister Patricia." Margaret looked confused. "Your sister?" "Patricia runs a women's shelter in Colorado Springs," Susan explained. "She's been working with domestic violence survivors for 20 years, and she has resources that most people don't know about. Safe houses, legal advocates, counselors who specialize in trauma recovery, even job placement assistance for women who need to relocate quickly." Thomas felt a surge of relief. He had been wondering how to connect Margaret with professional support services without alerting David to her plans. Having direct access to an experienced advocate would be invaluable. "More importantly," Susan continued, "Patricia knows how to help women disappear safely when their lives are in danger. She's worked with law enforcement on cases where restraining orders weren't enough, where women needed new identities and completely fresh starts." Margaret stared at Susan with something approaching awe. "You would do that for me? But you don't even know me." "I know enough," Susan said firmly. "I know that you've been taking care of our friend Thomas with extraordinary kindness for 3 years. I know that you're a professional who takes pride in your work. I know that you're brave enough to keep functioning normally while living in terror. And I know that no woman deserves to be trapped in a relationship that might end with her death." Margaret sent the dinner photos to David with hands that trembled only slightly, a marked improvement from her earlier panic. Thomas watched her carefully craft a text message that struck the right tone of dutiful communication without seeming overly chatty or suspicious. "He responded," Margaret said, showing them David's reply. "Food looks good. Don't stay too late. I'll be waiting." The message was brief, but loaded with implied threats. Thomas noticed that David hadn't expressed any concern for Margaret's well-being or asked if she needed anything. The communication was purely about monitoring and control. "Patricia wants to talk to you," Susan announced, holding out her phone. "She's been briefed on the basic situation, and she has some questions about your immediate safety needs." Margaret accepted the phone nervously, but her expression gradually relaxed as she spoke to Patricia. Thomas could hear only one side of the conversation, but Margaret's responses suggested that Patricia was asking detailed, practical questions about Margaret's resources, David's behavior patterns, and her long-term goals for recovery and independence. "She wants to talk to you too," Margaret said, handing the phone to Thomas. "She has some suggestions about how to coordinate with local law enforcement." Thomas spoke with Patricia for several minutes, impressed by her systematic approach to crisis intervention. She asked pointed questions about David's potential for violence, the security measures at his apartment building, and Thomas's willingness to provide temporary shelter and financial support for Margaret's transition to independence. "She says we need to move fast," Thomas reported after ending the call. "The longer Margaret stays in that apartment, the more likely David is to escalate to physical violence. But she also says we need to be smart about timing and coordination." Richard had been researching the Meridian Tower on his phone while Thomas spoke to Patricia. "I've been looking at the building's layout and security protocols," he said. "There might be a way to get Margaret's belongings without David knowing, but it would require precise timing and some creative problem-solving." He showed them his phone screen, which displayed the building's website and floor plans. The Meridian has a concierge service that includes personal shopping and errand running for residents. If we could convince them that Margaret is picking up items for David while he's out of town on business. That might work, Margaret said thoughtfully. David has used the concierge service before, and they know I live there. If I had a believable story about why I was collecting specific items, ... What about building security cameras? Thomas asked. Even if the concierge doesn't question Margaret's presence, won't there be video evidence of her removing belongings? Richard smiled grimly. That's where my knowledge of commercial security systems comes in handy. Most residential buildings like the Meridian record continuously, but only review footage when there's been a complaint or incident. If no one reports anything suspicious, the recordings just get automatically deleted after 30 days. Susan returned from the kitchen with plates and silverware, efficiently transforming Thomas's coffee table into an impromptu dining surface. You all need to eat while you plan, she declared. Crisis management requires fuel, and Margaret's beautiful. Dinner shouldn't go to waste. As they began eating, Thomas was struck by the surreal nature of their situation. Here they were, sharing an elegant meal while planning what amounted to a covert rescue operation. The duck breast was perfectly prepared, the wine was excellent, and the conversation was focused on extracting someone from a potentially lethal domestic situation. There's one more thing we need to consider, Margaret said quietly. David has been talking about taking a trip together, maybe to his parents' old house in Aspen. He says we need to get away from Denver, that the city is making him paranoid and affecting our relationship. Thomas set down his fork, understanding immediately why this information was crucial. He's planning to isolate you even further. Once he gets you to a remote location where you don't know anyone and have no resources... He could do anything, Margaret finished. And no one would. Nowhere to look for me. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. When is this trip supposed to happen? He hasn't given me a specific date, but he's been talking about it more frequently, maybe within the next week or two. He says he's tired of sharing me with my job, that we need time alone together to work on our relationship. Susan reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. That's not going to happen. We're getting you out of there before he has a chance to take you anywhere. Thomas looked around the table at his friends, at Margaret, at the evidence of a normal dinner party that was serving as cover for extraordinary circumstances. 3 hours ago, he had been a widower living quietly with his grief and his routines. Now he was part of a team planning to help someone escape from a dangerous relationship, and he felt more alive and purposeful than he had since Eleanor's death. All right, he said decisively. Let's finalize the plan. Margaret, you're not going back to that apartment tonight. You're staying here, where it's safe, and tomorrow we're going to get your belongings and your documents back. Then Patricia is going to help you start a new life somewhere David can't find you. Margaret looked around the table at these three. People who had transformed from strangers to allies in the space of a single evening. What if he comes looking for me here? What if he realizes I'm not coming home and decides to confront you? Thomas smiled with the kind of quiet confidence that had served him well in 30 years of solving complex problems. Then he'll discover that he's not the only one who's been planning for contingencies. The first sign that David suspected something was wrong came at exactly 9:47 p.m., when Margaret's phone began buzzing with a series of increasingly urgent text messages. She had been helping Susan clear the dinner dishes when the first message arrived, innocent enough. How much longer? But the messages that followed revealed the escalating paranoia that Thomas had come to recognize as David's signature behavior. Pattern, 9:48 p.m. You usually text me updates without being asked. 9:49 p.m. Are you avoiding your phone? 9:51 p.m. I drove by the house. There are still cars in the driveway. 9:52 p.m. Why haven't you responded? Margaret's face went pale as she read the messages aloud to the group. Thomas felt his blood pressure spike at the revelation that David was now conducting physical surveillance of his property, confirming their worst fears about the level of stalking behavior they were dealing with. "He's outside right now?" Richard asked, moving to the front window and carefully peering through the blinds. "I don't see any vehicles that don't belong," Thomas said, joining Richard at the window. "But that doesn't mean he's not there. He could be parked on a side street with a clear view of my driveway." Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, David was calling rather than texting. She stared at the screen with the expression of someone who had just seen a snake coiled on her doorstep. "Answer it," Susan said firmly. "But put it on speaker so we can all hear his tone and help you respond appropriately." Margaret's hands shook as she accepted the call. David's voice filled Thomas's living room, and the cold fury in his tone made everyone freeze. "Where exactly are you right now, Margaret?" "I'm in Mr. Whitmore's kitchen, finishing the cleanup from dinner," Margaret replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her obvious terror. "The Hartleys just left a few minutes ago. I've been sitting outside for 20 minutes. I saw them leave at 9:35. It's now almost 10 o'clock. What have you been doing for the past 20 minutes? Thomas noted the precision of David's surveillance timing and realized they were dealing with someone who had been watching the house systematically, probably taking notes about arrival and departure times, license plate numbers, and any unusual activity. "Washing dishes, putting away the good china, cleaning the kitchen," Margaret said. "Mr. Whitmore had me use his formal dining service tonight because these were important clients. Put him on the phone." The request sent a chill through the room. David was no longer content to monitor Margaret's activities indirectly. He was now demanding direct confirmation from Thomas, escalating his surveillance to include interrogating Margaret's employer. Margaret looked at Thomas with panic in her eyes, but he nodded calmly and took the phone from her hands. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The first direct confrontation with the man who had been terrorizing someone under his protection. "This is Thomas Whitmore," he said, keeping his voice professional and slightly annoyed, as if he were being interrupted from important work. "Mr. Whitmore, this is David Carpenter, Margaret's boyfriend. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I was concerned when Margaret didn't respond to my messages. She's usually very good about staying in touch when she's working late." David's voice was perfectly controlled, reasonable, even charming. Thomas could hear why Margaret had initially been attracted to this man. He sounded like a concerned partner making a perfectly reasonable inquiry about his girlfriend's whereabouts. But Thomas also heard the underlying threat in David's tone, the implicit message that Margaret's failure to respond promptly to his surveillance demands was unacceptable and would have consequences. "Margaret has been working continuously since 6:30, Thomas replied coolly. "I had her prepare a 5-course dinner for important business associates, then serve and clean up afterward. She's been in my kitchen for the past 20 minutes, dealing with the mess from cooking duck breast for 4 people. I appreciate you taking such good care of her," David said, and Thomas could hear the smile in his voice, the kind of predatory smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Margaret sometimes forgets to check her phone when she's focused on work. I just like to make sure she gets home safely." The possessive language wasn't lost on anyone in the room. David wasn't expressing concern for Margaret's welfare. He was asserting ownership, reminding Thomas that Margaret belonged to him and that her time away from his direct supervision was a privilege that could be revoked. "She'll be leaving in about 10 minutes, Thomas said. "I just need her to set up the coffee service for tomorrow morning since I have an early client meeting." It was a believable detail that explained the slight delay while also giving Margaret a few more minutes to compose herself before having to face David directly. "Perfect, I'll wait for her." The call ended, leaving the room in tense silence. Thomas handed the phone back to Margaret, who was trembling despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "He's not just watching the house," Richard said grimly. "He's conducting detailed surveillance, timing everything, taking notes." That level of obsessive monitoring suggests someone who's planning something more than just relationship control. Susan moved to sit beside Margaret again, her maternal instincts clearly activated by the young woman's distress. "Honey, you cannot. Go out to that car. I don't care what story we have to tell him, but you're not leaving this house tonight. But if I don't go home, if I don't follow the routine he expects..." Margaret's voice trailed off, but everyone in the room could imagine the escalation that would follow. Thomas's mind was working through options and consequences. David was clearly prepared for the possibility that Margaret might try to avoid coming home. His physical surveillance of the house, his precise timing of events, his demand to speak directly with Thomas, all of these behaviors suggested someone who had anticipated potential resistance and prepared countermeasures. "There's something else we need to consider," Thomas said slowly. "David now knows where I live, knows my name, probably knows details about my business and personal life. If Margaret disappears tonight, I become his primary suspect and likely target for retaliation." The implications hung heavy in the air. By helping Margaret, Thomas had inadvertently painted a target on his own back. David would assume that any attempt by Margaret to escape his control must have been facilitated by outside assistance, and Thomas was the obvious candidate. "Which is exactly why we can't back down now," Richard said firmly. "If David is already viewing Thomas as a threat, then trying to appease him by sending Margaret home won't actually make Thomas any safer. It will just confirm that threats and intimidation work, which will encourage David to escalate further." Margaret's phone buzzed with another text message. "I can see the kitchen lights are still on. What's taking so long?" The level of detailed surveillance was becoming genuinely frightening. David wasn't just waiting in his car. He was actively monitoring the house for signs of activity, probably using binoculars or some other optical equipment to watch for movement in the windows. "He's treating this like a military operation," Thomas observed. "Reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, detailed monitoring of the target. This isn't just domestic violence. It's stalking with tactical planning." Susan stood up abruptly, her expression determined. "Margaret, give me your car keys." "What? Your car keys?" "I'm going to drive your car home and tell David that you felt sick during cleanup, that Thomas asked me to drive you home because you were too nauseous to drive safely." The plan was bold and potentially dangerous, but Thomas could see the logic. Susan was an unknown variable in David's calculations, someone he hadn't planned for and couldn't easily intimidate or control. "Susan, that's incredibly brave, but also incredibly risky," Thomas said. "We don't know how David will react to an unexpected person, especially someone who might ask questions or remember details that could later be used against him." "Exactly," Susan replied with a grim smile. "I'm 62 years old, I've raised 3 children and buried both my parents, and I've been married to Richard for 38 years. I know how to handle bullies, and I'm not afraid of some paranoid boy who thinks he owns another human being." Margaret looked torn between gratitude and terror. "Mrs. Hartley, you don't understand what he's capable of. If he thinks you're interfering in his relationship, if he decides you're a threat, then he'll learn that some people fight back," Susan said simply. "Margaret, honey, you've been dealing with this man's threats and control for months. You've been isolated, terrorized, and made to feel like you have no options. But you're not alone anymore, and bullies like David count on their victims being alone." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for his friend's courage, but also deep concern for her safety. "Susan, at least let me come with you. Or better yet, let me drive Margaret's car while you follow in your own vehicle. That way you're not trapped in a car with David if he decides to get violent." "No," Susan said firmly. "If David sees multiple people involved in helping Margaret, he'll realize that she's built a support network, which will make him more desperate and dangerous. But if he thinks one concerned older woman just happened to help his sick girlfriend get home safely, That's a random act of kindness rather than a coordinated effort to help her escape. Richard pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. I'm sending Patricia a detailed message about tonight's events and David's escalating surveillance behavior. She needs to know that we're dealing with someone who's moved beyond psychological abuse to active stalking with possible premeditation of violence. Margaret's phone rang again. This time, David didn't wait for her to speak. Margaret, I'm getting concerned. It shouldn't take this long to clean up after dinner. Are you feeling all right? The fake concern in his voice was chilling. Thomas could hear that David was providing Margaret with an excuse for her delay, but also subtly threatening consequences if she didn't accept his offered explanation and come outside immediately. Actually, I'm not feeling very well, Margaret sighed, following Susan's lead. I think I might have eaten something that disagreed with me. Mrs. Hartley offered to drive me home since I'm feeling dizzy. Mrs. Hartley is still there? She came back to get her purse. She forgot it during dinner. It was a reasonable explanation that accounted for Susan's continued presence and willingness to help. Thomas was impressed by Margaret's quick thinking. Under pressure. Put Mrs. Hartley on the phone. Thomas, Richard, and Margaret all looked at Susan, who accepted the phone with the calm composure of someone who had spent decades managing family crises and community emergencies. Hello, David. This is Susan Hartley. I'm Richard's wife. We had dinner with Thomas tonight. Mrs. Hartley, thank you for taking care of Margaret. She sometimes pushes herself too hard when she's working. Again, the possessive language disguised as concern. David was asserting his expertise about Margaret's behavior patterns, while simultaneously thanking Susan for her assistance, establishing himself as the authority on Margaret's needs and well-being. She does seem dedicated to her work, Susan replied neutrally. But right now she looks quite pale and shaky. I think the best thing is to get her home so she can rest. I agree completely. I'll follow you to make sure you both get there safely. The offer was clearly not optional. David was ensuring that Susan couldn't take Margaret anywhere except directly to his apartment, while also positioning himself as protective rather than controlling. That's very thoughtful, Susan said, though Thomas could hear the steel beneath her polite tone. We'll be out in just a moment. She ended the call and looked around the room at three people who were all thinking the same thing. They were about to send a brave woman into potential danger with no way to protect her or extract her if David's behavior escalated. I want everyone to have my phone number, Susan said, pulling out her phone and beginning to type. And I want to establish a check-in protocol. If I don't text you within 30 minutes of leaving here, call the police and report a domestic violence situation at the Meridian Tower. Thomas realized that his quiet evening at home had transformed into a crisis that might end with police involvement, potential violence, and consequences he couldn't yet predict. But as he looked at Margaret's grateful expression and Susan's determined courage, he knew they had moved far beyond the point where retreat was possible or morally acceptable. Susan, he said quietly, if anything happens to you because of this, I'll never forgive myself. She smiled and patted his arm with the kind of maternal affection she might show to one of her own children. Thomas, honey, some things are worth taking risks for, and helping someone escape from a dangerous situation is definitely one of them. Susan gathered Margaret's purse and car keys with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. She checked her own phone to ensure it was fully charged, confirmed that she had Thomas's and Richard's contact information, and tucked a small canister of pepper spray into her jacket pocket with practiced ease. I've been carrying that since college, she explained when she noticed Thomas watching. 40 years in Colorado, and I've never had to use it. But there's a first time for everything. Margaret watched these preparations with a mixture of awe and guilt that was painful to witness. She had spent so many months believing she was alone, convinced that her problems were too complicated or dangerous for anyone else to handle, that seeing three near strangers risk their own safety for her well-being seemed to overwhelm her capacity for processing emotions. "Mrs. Hartley," Margaret said quietly, "when you get to the apartment, David will probably insist on walking you to your car. He likes to control every aspect of social interactions, especially when they involve me. Don't let him isolate you. In the parking garage or anywhere else where there aren't witnesses." Susan nodded, filing away this tactical information with the same attention she might give to directions for navigating unfamiliar terrain. "What else should I expect?" "He'll ask questions about dinner, about Mr. Whitmore, about what I said during the evening. He'll present it as casual conversation, but he's actually gathering intelligence. Don't volunteer any information beyond the basic facts: that we had duck breast, that the Hartleys seemed like nice people, that I felt sick during cleanup." Thomas was impressed by Margaret's ability to think strategically despite her emotional distress. Months of surviving David's interrogations had taught her to anticipate his methods and prepare appropriate responses. "Most importantly," Margaret continued, "don't let him convince you to come upstairs to the apartment. If he suggests that I need help getting settled, or that you should stay for a cup of coffee, or that he wants to thank you properly for your kindness, refuse politely but firmly. Once you're in that apartment, he controls the environment completely." Richard had been monitoring the front windows while Margaret briefed Susan on David's behavioral patterns. "I can see headlights from a parked vehicle about half a block down the street," he reported. "Engine running, positioned for a clear view of Thomas's driveway." The precision of David's surveillance location confirmed their assessment of his tactical sophistication. He had chosen a spot that allowed him to monitor their activities while maintaining plausible deniability about his presence in the quietest neighborhood. Susan took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "All right, Margaret, you're going to walk out to your car with me, looking appropriately sick but not terrified. We'll have a brief, normal conversation about you feeling better tomorrow. Then you'll get in the passenger seat, and I'll drive. David will follow us to the Meridian Tower, where I'll help you to the lobby and then leave immediately." "What if he tries to prevent you from leaving?" Thomas asked. "Then he'll discover that being rude to a 62-year-old woman in a public lobby with security cameras is a good way to attract unwanted attention from building staff and potentially law enforcement." Margaret stood up slowly, as if movement was difficult, a believable performance of someone feeling nauseated and unsteady. "There's one more thing you need to know. David will test you. He might claim that I forgot something in your car, or ask you to relay a message to Mr. Whitmore, or suggest that we should all get together socially sometime. These are all traps designed to see if you're just a good Samaritan, or if you're part of some larger plan to help me." Susan's expression hardened. "Let him test me. I've been dealing with manipulative people since before he was born." The two women walked toward the front door, and Thomas felt his heart rate spike with anxiety for Susan's safety. She was walking into a situation where her age and unfamiliarity with David's psychology could put her at serious disadvantage, despite her courage and good intentions. "Richard," Thomas said quietly, "we need to follow them. Not close enough to interfere, but close enough to respond if something goes wrong." Richard was already reaching for his car keys. "Agreed. And we need to coordinate with Patricia about emergency protocols. If David realizes that Margaret isn't coming back tomorrow, if he figures out that tonight was the beginning of her escape rather than just a sick evening, he's going to escalate rapidly." They watched through the window as Susan and Margaret emerged from the house and walked slowly toward Margaret's Honda Civic. Margaret moved with convincing difficulty, leaning slightly on Susan's arm for support. The performance was believable enough to fool casual observation, though Thomas wondered if David's intense scrutiny would detect any inconsistencies. The parked vehicle down the street immediately came to life, headlights brightening as David prepared to follow them. Thomas noted the make and model, a silver BMW X5, exactly as Margaret had described, and committed the license plate number to memory. He's maintaining about a 2-block distance, Richard observed as they watched the small convoy proceed toward downtown Denver. Professional surveillance spacing. This guy has definitely done this before. Thomas and Richard waited 5 minutes before following in Richard's Mercedes, taking a parallel route that would bring them to the Meridian Tower from a different direction. Thomas used the drive time to call Patricia and update her on the evening's developments. David's behavior tonight confirms our worst fears, Patricia said without preamble when Thomas described the surveillance and phone interrogation. He's moved into the final phase of relationship abuse, the phase where the abuser realizes they're losing control and decides that if they can't have their victim, no one can. What are the statistics on violence during this phase? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. 75% of domestic violence murders happen when the victim is trying to leave or has recently left the relationship, Patricia replied grimly. And the presence of firearms increases the lethality risk by 500%. Thomas, I need you to understand that Margaret is in more danger right now than she's ever been before. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. By helping Margaret, had he inadvertently pushed David toward violence? Was Margaret safer staying in an abusive relationship than attempting to escape from it? But here's the thing, Patricia continued, as if reading his thoughts. Margaret was already in mortal danger. David's talk about dying together, his increasing isolation and control tactics, his escalating surveillance, all of these behaviors indicate that he was already planning to kill her, probably within the next few weeks or months. By helping her escape tonight, you haven't created the danger. You've just moved up the timeline. Richard pulled into the Meridian Tower's visitor parking area just as Susan was helping Margaret out of the Honda Civic. David's BMW was parked in a residence space near the building entrance, and Thomas could see a tall figure in an expensive suit walking toward the two women. Even from a distance, David Carpenter was exactly what Thomas had expected, handsome in a calculated way. Impeccably dressed, moving with the kind of confident stride that suggested someone accustomed to controlling social situations. But there was something predatory in his posture, a barely contained tension that reminded Thomas of a hunting animal approaching prey. Thomas watched David embrace Margaret with what looked like genuine affection and concern, speaking earnestly to Susan while gesturing toward the building entrance. The performance was masterful, a loving boyfriend grateful to a kind stranger who had helped his sick girlfriend get home safely. But Thomas could see the subtle signs that revealed the performance's true nature. David's hand remained firmly on Margaret's lower back, not quite pushing, but definitely steering her movement. His attention to Susan was intense and calculating, as if he were memorizing details for later analysis. Most tellingly, his eyes constantly scanned the parking area and street, checking for signs of additional surveillance or unexpected variables. He knows something is wrong, Richard murmured. Look at his body language. He's performing concern and gratitude, but he's also conducting counter-surveillance. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Susan, lobby safe. David being polite, but pushy about staying longer. Margaret holding up well. Will text when I'm clear. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Thomas and Richard sat in the parking garage, monitoring the building entrance while maintaining periodic contact with Patricia, who was coordinating with Colorado Springs police to have units on standby in case the situation deteriorated. Finally, Susan emerged from the building alone, walking briskly toward Margaret's Honda, with the determined pace of someone who had successfully completed a difficult mission. She drove directly to where Thomas and Richard were waiting, parking beside their Mercedes with visible relief. That, Susan announced as she got out of the car, was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. And I've given birth 3 times and nursed my mother through terminal cancer. She handed Margaret's car keys to Thomas with hands that trembled slightly. David Carpenter is charming, polite, and absolutely terrifying. He asked approximately 50 questions about tonight's dinner, about you and your business, about Margaret's behavior during the evening. He presented it as grateful small talk, but it was actually a comprehensive debriefing designed to identify any inconsistencies in Margaret's story. "Did he suspect anything?" Richard asked. "He suspects everything," Susan replied. "That man doesn't believe in coincidences or innocent explanations. He's convinced that Margaret's illness tonight was somehow orchestrated, though I don't think he's figured out why or by whom." Thomas felt a chill of apprehension. If David was suspicious about tonight's events, Margaret would face intensive questioning and possibly violence once Susan left. "There's more," Susan continued. "While we were waiting for the elevator, David mentioned that he and Margaret might be taking a trip soon, maybe as early as this weekend. He said Margaret had been under stress lately and needed to get away from the city for some rest and relaxation. The timeline was accelerating faster than any of them had anticipated. If David was planning to take Margaret to an isolated location within days, they had perhaps 48 hours to extract her safely before she disappeared entirely. Thomas's phone rang. Patricia's number appeared on the screen, and her voice was tense with urgency when he answered. "Thomas, I've been in contact with Detective Sarah Morrison at Denver PD's Domestic Violence Unit. Based on everything you've told me about David's behavior, she believes we have enough evidence to pursue criminal stalking charges. But more importantly, she thinks we can get an emergency protective order that would require David to stay away from Margaret immediately." "What would that involve?" Thomas asked. "Margaret would need to file a formal complaint detailing David's threats, surveillance, and controlling behavior. Detective Morrison can meet with her first thing tomorrow morning to take her statement and photograph her injuries. If the judge agrees that Margaret is in imminent danger, we could have a restraining order in place by tomorrow afternoon." It was exactly the kind of official intervention Thomas had hoped for, but he wondered if legal solutions would be effective against someone who seemed to operate outside normal social constraints. "Patricia, what happens if David ignores the restraining order? What if a piece of paper doesn't deter someone who's already planning to commit violence?" "Then we move to phase 2, Patricia said grimly. "Safe house placement, new identity documentation, and relocation to a state where David can't track her down." "I've done this before, Thomas. Some abusers can be deterred by legal consequences, but others require more comprehensive escape strategies." Thomas looked at Susan and Richard, both of whom had risked their own safety tonight to help someone they barely knew. He thought about Margaret, alone in David's apartment, probably being questioned about every detail of the evening while trying to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed. "Set up the meeting with Detective Morrison," Thomas said finally. "Tomorrow morning, as early as possible. And Patricia, start preparing the safe house option. I have a feeling we're going to need it." As they drove back to Thomas's house in Richard's Mercedes, following Susan who was returning Margaret's Honda, Thomas realized that his life had been permanently altered by the events of this evening. Tomorrow, he would wake up in a world where he was actively involved in helping someone escape from a dangerous relationship, where he might be called upon to testify in court proceedings, where a violent man considered him an enemy. But he also realized that for the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt truly alive. The grief and isolation that had defined his existence for 3 years had been replaced by purpose and connection. Margaret's courage in seeking help had reminded him that life was worth fighting for, that protecting someone in danger was both a privilege and a responsibility. "You know," Richard said as they pulled into Thomas's driveway, "Eleanor would be proud of what you did tonight." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle into his bones. Eleanor had always believed that kindness was not a weakness but a form of strength, that protecting others was the highest expression of human dignity. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, "we finish what we started. Margaret is not going back to that apartment. David Carpenter is not taking her to Aspen, and she's going to have the chance to build a life free from fear and control. Susan, who had been listening to their conversation, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a dangerous mission. Tomorrow, she agreed, we help a brave woman reclaim her freedom. And if David Carpenter doesn't like it, he can take it up with the police, the courts, and 3 people who aren't afraid of bullies. As Thomas unlocked his front door and stepped back into the house where this extraordinary evening had begun, he realized that Margaret's broken coffee cup had been more than just an accident. It had been the moment when, carefully maintained, secrets finally shattered, revealing truths that demanded action and courage. The widower who had noticed bruises on his cook's arms had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not through observation, but through the willingness to ask difficult questions and act on uncomfortable answers. And sometimes, helping someone else heal becomes the path to healing yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.